The Pacific sun had barely risen over Guadalcanal, and already the jungle throbbed with life and decay, the thick air heavy with the scent of damp earth, sweat, salt, and rotting vegetation. Private John O'Connor paused for a moment, wiping the sweat and mud from his brow with the back of his hand, his fingers leaving streaks of dark grime across his forehead. His C-ration, slung tightly against his back, shifted slightly as he adjusted the strap, revealing the familiar shape of the small metal canister he had carried for months. He knew the taste of it by heart: canned meat, loaf, tough and grey but hearty, dry biscuits that crumbled between his teeth, a square of chocolate that had softened in the tropical heat, and instant coffee that, when mixed with lukewarm water, offered a bitter semblance of warmth and energy. Not gourmet, certainly, but enough to keep his muscles moving, to keep his lungs filled with oxygen as he and his comrades navigated the uneven, root-choked terrain. Around him, the other Marines, barely men at 22, 23 years old, moved with the precision of trained hunters, their eyes scanning the foliage, rifles clutched in mud-smeared hands, boots sinking into the soft earth with every step. Each carried nearly 60 pounds of gear, yet their faces betrayed only fatigue, not despair. They were fed, they were fueled, they were alive, and that knowledge gave them a quiet strength that had nothing to do with firepower or weapons. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The jungle itself seemed alive, whispering threats in the sway of palms, the rustle of leaves, and the distant cry of unseen birds. Monkeys leapt between branches overhead, chattering warnings of intruders, while the undergrowth threatened to snag boots and rip at pants. John glanced at the compass pinned to his chest, noted the direction of their march. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the ferns and moss-covered rocks, beads of water dripping down leaves into the shallow streams that carved paths through the forest floor. Each drop seemed to echo the passage of time, a slow reminder that every moment in the jungle was a test of endurance, patience, and luck. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a syncopated drum that matched the distant rhythm of his squad, and he took a deliberate breath, tasting the damp air mixed with the faint, acrid scent of gun oil and old smoke lingering from earlier skirmishes. Meanwhile, barely 10 miles north, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Army crouched low in a shallow trench, the earth cold and unyielding beneath him. His uniform, once crisply pressed and neat, was now a patchwork of dried sweat stains, tears, and mud, and the small strip of cloth pinned above his left breast pocket had curled and frayed from constant exposure. Tanaka's stomach gnawed at him relentlessly, a hollow echo that no amount of discipline could silence. His daily ration, a small bowl of rice, a thin smear of miso soup, and a scrap of dried fish, had left him dizzy after only a few hours of morning patrol. The rice, polished and hard, clung stubbornly to the inside of his mouth, while the miso soup offered only a faint hint of warmth and salt. The fish, sun-dried and nearly tasteless, crumbled in his fingers, a cruel reminder of the meals of his youth. He remembered the days before the war, when bowls were full, fish were fresh, and laughter had been easy. Meals were a ritual, a comfort, a shared joy among friends and family, and he had never imagined that one day eating would become a battle itself. Those days were gone. Supplies dwindled, shipments were intercepted or destroyed by Allied raids, and yet he was expected to match the endurance of Americans whose bodies were nourished on calories nearly 4 times what he and his allies, men, consumed. The irony was bitter, almost cruel. He clenched his fists around the rifle, feeling the familiar grooves of the stock press against his palms, and willed himself to focus, to channel the gnawing hunger into vigilance rather than despair. Around him, his squad moved like shadows of themselves, barely speaking, eyes narrowed, and faces pale from lack of nourishment. Soldiers stumbled, legs trembling, yet officers demanded unwavering precision. Tanaka's voice shook as he issued commands, the strain of leadership pressing upon him as heavily as the heat and humidity. Every step into the dense foliage felt like dragging his body through molten lead. Every breath was a labor. Still, he could not afford hesitation. Scouts had reported enemy activity ahead, movement that indicated American patrols approaching. The whispers of the jungle seemed to conspire against them, the rustle of leaves masking the sound of shifting feet, the distant gurgle of streams echoing like a drumbeat of warning. Tanaka squinted through the humid haze, sweat stinging his eyes, and forced himself to focus on the shape of trees, the slight disturbance of foliage, the glint of sunlight reflecting off metal. Each observation was a matter of survival, each decision a choice between life and death. On the American side, the march continued with a rhythm born of conditioning and sustenance. Marines adjusted their packs, checked their rifles, and exchanged brief nods or muttered words of encouragement. Sergeant Thomas Bradley, 35, a veteran of North Africa campaigns, called out instructions with clipped efficiency, his voice carrying across the jungle canopy. He was a mountain of a man, his beard flecked with grey, eyes sharp and calculating. "Steady now, watch your footing," he barked, and the squad tightened their formation. For them, calories were not a concern. They were an invisible armour, a quiet force that allowed them to push harder, march further, and fight longer than any human being might have expected. The canned meats, chocolate, biscuits, and instant coffee were more than food. They were sustenance for body, mind, and spirit, a tangible demonstration of the logistical power behind every operation. John paused for a brief rest, crouching beside a knotted root and taking a bite from a biscuit. It crumbled between his teeth, dry but familiar, and he washed it down with a swig of lukewarm coffee from the collapsible cup tucked into his pack. He could taste the sugar, faintly artificial, but enough to give him a jolt of energy. Around him, his fellow Marines did the same, chewing, swallowing, and moving again, a well-oiled machine of endurance and willpower. Every step through the jungle was an exercise in discipline, each movement reinforced by the knowledge that they were fed, that their energy stores were full, that their bodies could handle what the island threw at them. Meanwhile, Tanaka's men were suffering silently. Private Kenta, Saito, only 19, leaned heavily against the trench wall, his lips cracked and dry, eyes glassy from hunger and exhaustion. He tried to swallow a piece of dried fish, gagging at the taste, but force himself. The senior officers, aware of the shortage, avoided sharing their frustration, but their eyes betrayed the unspoken truth. They were running out of time, supplies, and hope. Tanaka knew that morale was as fragile as their bodies, and that one wrong move could lead to panic, desertion, or worse. He looked at the map, pinned with frayed pins on a makeshift board carved from bamboo and mud, tracing the paths they were expected to patrol. Each line represented more than territory. It represented survival, strategy, and the crushing weight of hunger that no ration could completely offset. The jungle seemed to close in from all sides. Cicadas droned, mosquitoes buzzed near every exposed patch of skin, and vines tugged at boots, sleeves, and rifles. The Americans moved with purpose, bodies fueled by calories and discipline, the Japanese with silent desperation, each step heavier than the last. Tanaka's stomach twisted, a gnawing emptiness that demanded attention but could not be sated. He clenched his teeth and focused on the mission, on the men under his command, and on the faint hope that reinforcements or resupply might arrive. Hours passed in the sticky heat, sweat-soaking clothing, salt crusting around collars, and yet the Americans pressed on with energy to spare, while Tanaka's unit slowed, survival edging out strategy as the priority. The disparity between the two forces was more than physical. It was psychological. John felt alert, aware, capable of reacting instantly to threats that might arise from the dense undergrowth. He could laugh briefly with a comrade at the absurdity of stepping into a mud pool, or comment on the resilience of a tree trunk that had forced them to climb over it. Every joke, every breath, every step was underwritten by the invisible strength of nourishment. Tanaka, conversely, felt the creeping fog of hunger cloud his mind. Orders required energy he did not have. Vigilance demanded attention his body struggled to provide. He pushed forward, counting each step as a victory, measuring the hours by the sound of insects rather than the sun, and hoping that he could endure until evening, when rest might bring slight relief. As midday approached, the Americans paused beside a small stream, the water cold and clear. John scooped some into his cupped hands and drank deeply, the liquid washing over his tongue, quenching thirst, and offering a small but vital surge of energy. Nearby, other Marines ate small portions of their rations, sharing biscuits or chocolate squares with a wink and a nod. Hydration and calories combined to form a rhythm of life that made the jungle less deadly, the mission more achievable. Across the distance, Tanaka's squad reached another shallow creek. The water, though present, offered little comfort. Some of the men drank sparingly, rationing their sips, while others dipped a handkerchief to moisten lips. No biscuit, no chocolate, no warm beverage accompanied the water, only the bitter taste of survival. John adjusted his pack and signalled the squad to move. The march resumed, and the sun climbed higher, casting dappled patterns across the jungle floor. Birds scattered, startled by the crunch of boots, the snapping of twigs, and the disciplined shuffle of gear. Each step was a testament to preparation, endurance, and the invisible power of sustenance. Across the miles, Tanaka's men pushed onward, hunger pressing on each motion, each breath a reminder that without proper nutrition, even courage could falter. Yet they pressed on, as warriors, as men bound to duty, as human beings forced to endure far more than most could imagine. In that thick, suffocating jungle, the two forces moved like currents on the same map, separated by miles yet bound by conflict. The Americans marched with the quiet confidence of being fed, fueled, and strong. The Japanese struggled with the gnawing emptiness of daily rations, each calorie counted, each movement taxed, every heartbeat a silent challenge. The disparity was a weapon invisible to the eye yet potent as any rifle, artillery shell, or grenade. And as the sun rose fully over Guadalcanal, casting long shadows across the twisted roots and tangled vines, both sides carried on, each step a testament to survival, will, and the cruel mathematics of war. On the American side, the morning began with the smell of sizzling bacon and roasted coffee beans drifting across the makeshift camp in the dense Pacific jungle, the scent cutting through the dampness of early mist and the acrid tang of gunpowder from distant skirmishes. Type A garrison meals were meticulously designed, not just to sustain, but to fortify the men for the grueling days ahead. In the mess tents, improvised stoves roared to life as cooks some as young as 18. Others, veterans, nearing 35, bustled between steaming pots and trays of bread, eggs, roasted chicken, and slabs of bacon, the metal utensils clanging with a rhythm that echoed against canvas walls. Canned fruits were stacked neatly on wooden tables, glinting under the faint sunlight that filtered through the tent flaps, offering a splash of colour against the drab green of the camp. Soldiers could eat until they were sated, consuming a minimum of 4,000 calories, often stretching to 4,800, depending on appetite, exertion, and mood. For Private John O'Connor, the simple act of cracking an egg into a sizzling pan felt like a triumph. He watched the edges curl, the yolk shine like amber, and he knew that each bite was an investment in endurance, a buffer against fatigue, a fuel for the muscles that would carry him through mud, rain, and enemy fire. Field kitchens were no luxury hotels, but they were a lifeline, temporary reprieves, from the chaos of war, spaces where warmth, nourishment, and morale intertwined. The cooks would joke as they ladled portions, tossing a biscuit here, a square of chocolate there. Eat first, fight later, they said, the humour as much a seasoning as the butter and sugar in the meals themselves. The logic was simple and effective. Calories in, firepower out. Soldiers carried this principle in their bodies, each gulp of coffee, each bite of bacon, each morsel of bread translating directly into stamina, strength, and focus. Even the smaller Type C rations, carried on long patrols far from the mess tents, were calorie-dense and surprisingly palatable. Each metal can contain shredded or cubed meats, sometimes with stews of beans, occasionally macaroni or potatoes, all preserved to survive the tropical heat and the rough handling of transport. A square of chocolate or a sugar packet could seem miraculous in the jungle, a small victory that temporarily pushed back exhaustion, heat stroke, and the creeping despair of isolation. Condiments, salt, pepper, powdered milk, or tiny packets of mustard offered familiar flavors, reminders of home kitchens, of simpler times, of breakfasts not interrupted by artillery or the cries of wounded comrades. Soldiers would often sit in small clusters on the forest floor, sharing a can of meat, splitting biscuits, pouring coffee into small cups made from tin, and for a brief moment the war receded. Laughter, the rarest of luxuries, rang softly between trees, an echo of life rather than death. Meanwhile, barely 10 miles away, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka and his men moved silently through a different world. A world where hunger shaped every decision, where scarcity dictated motion and thought alike. Their daily rations had once been measured at 1,200 calories, a figure that, on paper, seemed sufficient, but, in reality, was barely enough to keep a man alive for a day of intense physical exertion. Morning meals consisted of thin strips of rice and barley, often supplemented with a small, sun-dried fish or a piece of seaweed. Meat was nearly mythical, a distant dream of flavor, nutrition, and warmth. Seasonings vanished months into the campaign. Salt, soy sauce, and miso were rationed to the point of disappearance, leaving only the bare, monotone taste of rice to carry men through the morning patrol. One day, a soldier might scrape together a piece of whale meat from a rationed can, bitter and chewy, the salt crystallizing on his lips. The next day, he might gnaw the tough fibers of a rabbit, scavenged from the forest, sinew sticking stubbornly to teeth. Each bite was survival. Each swallow a small act of defiance against the emptiness clawing at the stomach. Morale wavered as the disparity became increasingly obvious. Officers whispered behind hands, observing the gaunt faces, the trembling hands gripping rifles, the subtle stumbles over roots and rocks that were as much fatigue from hunger as from terrain. When captured, Americans described their rations. Japanese soldiers could scarcely believe it. The concept of marching through mud, under relentless sun or tropical rain, carrying heavy packs, and then engaging in combat while fueled by 4,800 calories seemed impossible, almost supernatural. The idea that a man could endure hours of exertion, think clearly, and maintain focus while consuming such abundance was beyond comprehension. Tanaka carried a small notebook, edges frayed, containing detailed notes on rations, daily patrols, and observations of American behavior. Each page told a story of disparity, of the tangible power that food offered. He watched American patrols from concealed positions, noting how they moved with precision, energy, and coordination. Each swing of a rifle, each leap over a fallen log, each call and response in radio chatter was supported by a body that had been properly nourished, and he felt a quiet bitterness at the contrast. Around him, his men whispered, sharing scraps, comparing what little they had. Private Kenta Saito, barely 19, traced the edges of a can of rationed fish with trembling fingers, a ritual to remind himself that at least he had something to eat, however meager. The bitter taste of reality was compounded by envy, by awe, by frustration. They were soldiers, trained to endure, to fight, to follow orders. And yet the Americans seemed almost superhuman in their resilience, their energy, their capacity to march, fight, and survive without faltering. Back at the American camp, meals were more than sustenance. They were a psychological armor. The simple act of eating a warm breakfast, sharing a laugh over a burnt biscuit, or savoring a rare piece of chocolate reinforced the bond between men, creating a network of strength and morale that no enemy could easily break. Lieutenant Samuel Harper, aged 32, observed the men from the mess line, noting their alertness, the glint of focus in their eyes, and the ease with which they handled rifles and equipment. The calories they consumed translated directly into performance, stamina, and tactical advantage. Every ounce of meat, every slice of bread, every packet of sugar or chocolate became a weapon in itself, a tangible force multiplier on the battlefield. Soldiers carried this knowledge unconsciously, understanding that the food they consumed was not indulgence but necessity, a key to survival and dominance. For Tanaka and his men, each day was a negotiation with their own bodies. The heat pressed down relentlessly, the jungle a dense labyrinth of mud, insects, and hidden threats. Soldiers calculated their movements carefully, conserving energy wherever possible, rationing their strength to match their rations. The thin slivers of food were measured, shared, and often saved for later in the day, when hunger threatened to overcome concentration. Sleep offered little relief, as the body's weakness and the quiet mind's constant vigilance combined into a restless, exhausting cycle. Conversations were sparse, laughter rare. Even small victories, a captured fruit, a fresh stream of water, a brief moment of shade were magnified by the scarcity of comfort, by the absence of abundance. At midday, the American camp buzzed with quiet energy. Soldiers refilled canteens from a nearby stream, dipped biscuits into steaming coffee, and occasionally received letters or packages from home, small reminders of a life beyond the jungle and war. Supplies were abundant, carefully organized, and rationed not to save calories, but to ensure consistency and morale. A Marine could consume 4,000 to 4,800 calories without fear of depletion, allowing body and mind to operate at peak capacity. Even the Type C rations, compact and portable, carried enough energy to support long patrols or sudden skirmishes, their flavor and texture a small comfort in a vast, humid wilderness. The size, abundance of food allowed for flexibility, spontaneity, and resilience. Soldiers joked, shared stories, and occasionally debated the merits of chocolate versus biscuits, of coffee strength, and the occasional luxury of canned fruit. In every bite lay not only nutrition but also a reaffirmation of humanity, a claim that even in war, the men retained some portion of home, comfort, and stability. By contrast, Tanaka's men pressed on with grim determination. Each movement was a conscious expenditure of energy, each breath a calculation against limited fuel stores. The jungle seemed heavier, more oppressive, when the stomach was empty, and every task, raising a rifle, climbing a slope, listening for distant noise, required deliberate effort. Private Saito, his hands trembling from hunger, adjusted the strap of his pack and moved forward, eyes squinting against the glare of sunlight filtering through the leaves. The men shared what little they had, the communal experience of scarcity, forming a fragile bond. Yet the psychological toll was immense. Envy, awe, and frustration gnawed at the edges of discipline. Observing the Americans, the men understood that their exhaustion was not solely due to terrain or climate, but to the yawning gap between what they consumed and what the enemy had at their disposal. By evening, the Americans gathered once more around campfires, sharing stories, rationing small luxuries like chocolate squares, and preparing for night watches with full stomachs and replenished energy. The Type A and Type C rations, combined with careful planning and logistics, had done more than feed men. They had strengthened an army, reinforced morale, and provided a tangible edge in combat. Across the miles, Tanaka's soldiers huddled in makeshift shelters, eating quietly, counting the scraps, and enduring another day on 1,200 calories. Their movements were slower, more deliberate, but no less determined. Every swallow was a challenge, every step a testament to resilience. Each day was a negotiation between survival, duty, and the gnawing reality of hunger, while the Americans, unknowingly, demonstrated the profound power of abundant sustenance in shaping the course of human endurance and, ultimately, the war itself. By nightfall, the disparity was stark and undeniable. Fires flickered in the American camp, illuminating faces that were tired but nourished, strong and alert. Laughter and conversation mingled with the scent of roasted chicken and coffee, a quiet assertion of humanity and advantage. In the Japanese trenches, shadows stretched long and men whispered to each other, hands pressed against empty stomachs, eyes weary, yet hearts resolved. They endured because they must, because discipline and honor demanded it, because survival required it. The invisible gap, 4,800 calories versus 1,200, was more than food. It was power, energy, morale, and the subtle weapon that shaped the battlefield, in ways unseen but deeply felt. The day ended not with a decisive battle, but with the quiet, relentless truth of war. Those who were fed fought differently, moved differently, and lived differently. And those who were starved endured, imagining a world in which a full meal could grant strength beyond measure, almost supernatural, almost untouchable, almost enough to change the fate of men and nations alike. By noon, the sun had climbed high over Guadalcanal, beating down relentlessly on Private John O'Connor and his unit as they navigated the unforgiving jungle. Sweat ran in rivulets down the faces of the Marines, mingling with the mud caked into their hair, uniforms, and boots. The air was thick, sticky with humidity, and carried the sharp smell of decaying vegetation, salt from the nearby ocean, and the faint, acrid tang of spent gunpowder from earlier skirmishes. O'Connor adjusted the strap of his pack, nearly 60 pounds of gear pressing against his back, feeling the reassuring weight of the C-rations securely fastened inside. Each meal had been meticulously prepared, carefully packed with enough calories to sustain not just survival, but performance. 4,000 to 4,800 calories were tucked into tins and cans, biscuits wrapped in wax paper, squares of chocolate, and instant coffee packets, ready to fuel muscles, minds, and morale. Every bite consumed earlier in the day, every sip of coffee, every morsel of protein had accumulated, converting into energy that moved through him in tangible, almost electric currents. His legs did not tire as quickly, his mind remained sharp, his senses were heightened. He could hear the faint rustle of lizards scuttling over fallen leaves, the distant call of a tropical bird, the subtle snap of a twig under the weight of another marine ahead. They advanced in staggered formation, rifles raised, machetes slicing through thick vines that clung to their limbs like living chains. The jungle seemed to resist them, but they pressed forward with a rhythm and precision honed by training, discipline, and nourishment. O'Connor's eyes scanned the surroundings constantly. A fallen coconut tree created a natural bridge over a trench filled with stagnant water, and he vaulted across it with barely a pause. Nearby, Corporal David Reynolds, aged 24, hoisted his pack over the obstacle, chest heaving but steady. "Keep moving," he muttered, a grin breaking through the grime on his face. There was camaraderie in the struggle, a sense of shared power that came from bodies adequately fueled. When they stopped briefly to check bearings, hands reached into packs for small snacks, chocolate or dried fruit, consumed quickly, almost ritualistically, each bite reinforcing their strength. Lieutenant Harold Benton, 32, noted the efficiency of his men. Their pace did not falter, their rifles were steady, and their eyes remained clear, scanning for enemy positions, signs of ambush, or hidden traps in the dense green of the jungle. The food they carried was not merely survival, it was a force multiplier, transforming ordinary men into endurance machines capable of feats that seemed almost superhuman to an observer who had not seen the meticulous logistics behind it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Meanwhile, barely 10 miles away, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka and his patrol trudged along a parallel path. Their progress was markedly different. Each step seemed to cost a pound of strength, each breath a labor in the suffocating humidity. Tanaka, aged 29, adjusted the strap of his pack, feeling the emptiness in his stomach gnaw at his focus. Their daily rations were scarcely 1,200 calories, usually composed of a thin smear of rice, barley, and occasionally dried fish or a strip of seaweed. Meat was rare, a distant luxury that had long vanished, leaving the soldiers to scavenge rabbits, snails, or even bitter, fibrous chunks of whale meat from rationed cans. Seasonings had long disappeared, leaving flavorless sustenance that did nothing to lift morale or sustain vigor. Their pace faltered over the same fallen coconut tree that the Americans crossed with ease. Private Kenta Saito, only 19, collapsed beside the trench, shaking, sweat pouring into his eyes. Officers barked commands, words clipped, harsh, encouraging men to rise and continue. Every movement required immense effort, not only against the terrain, but against the gnawing, pervasive hunger that seemed to sap more than just physical strength. The jungle, thick with vines, humidity, and swarms of insects, became an enemy in itself. Each step, each swing of a rifle, each glance over a shoulder was a negotiation with exhaustion, a careful measurement of remaining energy. O'Connor's unit moved with a rhythm that seemed almost choreographed. The men fell into positions naturally, covering each other's flanks, scanning the underbrush, communicating with subtle gestures or brief hand signals. Sergeant Philip Jackson, aged 27, paused to load his rifle, glancing at a nearby Marine who struggled with a stubborn vine. "Need a hand?" he called, voice low but steady. The Marine nodded, and Jackson cut the vine away effortlessly, a simple act made possible by energy maintained over the previous meals. In the distance, faint noises suggested enemy presence, yet the men pressed on, bodies and minds clear, senses alert. Each bite of a previous meal, each sip of coffee, each morsel of chocolate consumed hours earlier, translated directly into coordination, speed, and reflexes. Fatigue was present but manageable. It did not dictate their movements, nor did it compromise their judgment. They could respond to ambush, react to sudden threats, and still maintain offensive capability. Energy flowed through them as predictably and reliably as the tide of the ocean nearby, a product of abundant rations, meticulous preparation, and disciplined consumption. For Tanaka, the story was starkly different. The patrol moved like shadows of themselves, limbs heavy, muscles trembling, jaws clenching to stave off hunger pangs. Saito struggled to his feet, and Tanaka placed a hand on his shoulder. "Keep moving," he urged, voice roughened by both exhaustion and frustration. The men's eyes, dull with fatigue, followed his direction not out of enthusiasm but out of necessity. Each step consumed what little energy remained. Each breath reminded them of their insufficiency. When a sudden noise erupted a bird, a falling branch, they flinched, not with agility, but with strain, muscles reacting slowly, reflexes dulled. Their rifles felt heavier, packs burdensome, boots cumbersome as mud clung to every surface. Unlike the Americans, they could not strike and retreat with efficiency, could not maneuver freely or regroup quickly. Each tactical decision was limited by the body's capacity, each engagement constrained by the ever-present awareness of physical depletion. Hunger, subtle and relentless, was a weapon wielded by circumstance rather than combat, shaping every action and dictating every motion. As the afternoon progressed, the Americans stopped briefly beside a stream. O'Connor knelt, cupping water into his hands, drinking deeply, while others refilled canteens. The water, cool against the skin and throat, revitalized them further, a small but crucial reinforcement to the calories already consumed. They snacked on biscuits, tore pieces of canned meat into smaller portions, and, in between bites, checked maps, coordinated positions, and adjusted formations. The abundance of food allowed flexibility. Men could conserve, expend, or distribute energy strategically, responding to the demands of the environment and the enemy alike. Lieutenant Benton observed the men, with quiet satisfaction. Their faces, though streaked with mud and sweat, carried clarity and focus. Hands were steady, rifles aligned, movements synchronized. In another context, these men could have been athletes, workers, or students, but here, in the dense jungle of Guadalcanal, they were soldiers performing at the peak of human potential, fed, fueled, and fortified by food that was abundant, varied, and carefully managed. In contrast, Tanaka's patrol moved in intermittent bursts, stopping frequently as exhaustion overtook them. Each pause carried anxiety, the knowledge that they could not linger too long, yet could not sustain continuous movement. Saito, his legs trembling, sank to one knee, pressing his hand against the jungle floor to steady himself. Nearby, Corporal Hiro Matsuda, aged 26, tried to share a small scrap of dried fish, but even this small gesture offered limited comfort. Officers rationed encouragement as carefully as they rationed words. Each command was precise, clipped, essential. Each soldier was acutely aware that even minor exertions, climbing a root-laden slope, ducking under a branch, adjusting the weight of a pack, came with significant cost to a body that was chronically undernourished. Morale was fragile, maintained only by discipline, camaraderie, and the iron will to survive. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the jungle floor, yet O'Connor's patrol maintained pace. The men moved fluidly through dense undergrowth, alert to every sound, every rustle, every glimmer of movement. The calories stored in their muscles allowed rapid recovery from sudden exertion. When a small enemy skirmish erupted nearby, the Marines reacted instantly, firing, advancing, retreating, and regrouping without hesitation. Each movement was precise, controlled, almost instinctive, a demonstration of what proper nourishment combined with rigorous training could achieve. There, success was not only tactical but physiological. The food they consumed had transformed them into more effective warriors, bodies capable of sustained effort, resilience, and recovery that the enemy could scarcely match. Meanwhile, Tanaka's men endured, limping forward through the oppressive heat, sweat blinding their eyes, hunger gnawing relentlessly. Every encounter with the environment was magnified by scarcity. A thorn in a boot caused a disproportionate delay. A fallen branch required strategic calculation rather than natural motion. A faint noise elicited a delayed, uncertain response. The disparity was not lost on Tanaka, who noted with quiet frustration that the Americans were not only stronger, but more capable, more alert, and more resilient, their advantage rooted not merely in training or tactics, but in the invisible, relentless power of calories consumed and energy maintained. By evening, the Americans established a temporary encampment along a ridge. Fires crackled, food was prepared, and the men ate with satisfaction, replenishing what had been expended. Type A and Type C rations provided warmth, comfort, and sustenance. The act of eating, of sharing, of enjoying even small luxuries reinforced morale and readiness for the days ahead. Across the same jungle miles, Tanaka's patrol huddled in makeshift shelters, consuming minimal scraps, rationed rice, or a thin strip of fish. Hunger remained an oppressive presence, shaping every thought, limiting every motion, and defining the limits of endurance. Where the Americans moved with energy, flexibility, and precision, the Japanese moved with caution, determination, and the quiet resignation of men constrained by scarcity. Hunger was an invisible force shaping the battlefield, a silent divider of capability and will, amplifying the effect of every ration, every calorie, every morsel, and making abundance an unseen weapon as lethal as any rifle, bayonet, or artillery shell. By nightfall, the Americans, rested, alert yet secure, their energy reserves replenished and their spirits buoyed. The jungle noises persisted, but the soldiers' readiness remained unwavering. Meals had fortified them, not just physically, but mentally, granting an edge that could tip the scales in unpredictable circumstances. Tanaka's men, by contrast, lay in quiet discomfort, muscles sore, stomachs hollow, and minds weary. Discipline and resolve held them together, yet every movement was a negotiation with hunger, every thought weighed against fatigue. The contrast was stark, the disparity undeniable, and the lesson of the day clear. Nourishment was power, scarcity was weakness, and the invisible battle for calories could shape outcomes as profoundly as any firefight. The day ended not with a decisive engagement, but with the relentless truth of jungle warfare. Those who were fed, moved, struck, and recovered with efficiency. Those who were starved, endured, pushed, and survived by will alone, shadows of their true potential, facing not only an enemy of flesh and steel, but of circumstance, deprivation, and the unforgiving demands of the tropical jungle itself. The midday sun had burned away most of the morning mist, leaving a sticky heat clinging to every leaf, branch, and inch of skin on Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka and his men as they pushed deeper into the Guadalcanal jungle. Sweat-soaked uniforms clung to backs and chests, packs dug into shoulders, and every step was an exertion that seemed magnified by the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. The moist air carried the scent of decay, a mixture of rotting foliage, stagnant water, and the faint metallic tang of rusted weapons. Yet amid this oppressive environment, a small, unexpected windfall arrived, a captured American field manual, left behind after a hurried retreat by a Marine patrol. It was wrapped in oilcloth, pages slightly crumpled but intact, and as Tanaka carefully opened it, a sense of foreboding mixed with curiosity took hold. The cover, simple and bureaucratic, bore a clear title: Field Rations and Preparation Guidelines, United States Marine Corps, 1942 edition. He turned the pages slowly, disbelief building with every line. The document detailed the composition of C-rations, Type A and Type B meals, and included the caloric content of every item, alongside instructions for preparation in both rear garrisons and frontline conditions. His eyes scanned the lists: biscuits, canned meats, cheese, chocolate, powdered milk, coffee packets, dried fruit, sugar, and condiments, each item described with precision, weights measured in ounces and grams, portions calculated for efficiency and sustenance. 4,800 calories per day. 4,800 calories. Tanaka's fingers trembled as he whispered the number aloud, almost as if speaking it gave it reality. His men, crouched nearby, looked on with curiosity, suspicion, and a creeping sense of fear. How could any human being consume this much and then continue to march through mud, cut through jungle vines, dig trenches, fire rifles, and engage in hand-to-hand combat without faltering? The reality struck them in waves. Each page revealed not just the components of American rations, but also the meticulous planning behind their delivery. Type A garrison meals were closest to home comforts: roast chicken, fried bacon, scrambled eggs, canned fruits, fresh bread, and hot coffee. Type B field rations were pre-packaged, requiring preparation by field kitchens, yet offering virtually the same caloric density. Type C rations were portable, designed for individual soldiers in forward positions, and still provided roughly 3,000 to 4,000 calories daily. Tanaka's mind raced. Their own rations, once adequate at 1,200 calories, seemed pitifully insufficient by comparison. Thin rice, occasional dried fish, small strips of seaweed, and the rare morsel of rabbit or whale, meat were all that sustained them. The disparity was staggering, an invisible wall of power separating them from the enemy. Tanaka traced the lists with a shaking finger, noting the variety: protein, carbohydrates, sugars, and fats carefully balanced. He remembered moments when his soldiers had collapsed from exhaustion, their muscles trembling, their eyes glazed. He had urged them onward with clipped commands, knowing that survival demanded obedience. Yet now he understood why the Americans could push past exhaustion, march for hours, and still strike with precision and lethality. The secret was not skill alone, but the simple, profound advantage of nourishment. Calories were not merely energy, they were armor, fuel for endurance, and a force multiplier that no amount of bravery could replace. Tanaka gathered the officers, whispering the details of the manual under the thick canopy, where light filtered in mottled green and gold. Lieutenant Akira Fujimoto, aged 31, squinted at the pages, lips parted in disbelief. Captain Masato Ishikawa, aged 34, pinched the bridge of his nose, silent, processing the information. Each soldier present felt the weight of it pressing down, heavier than the humidity, heavier than the sweat-soaked packs they carried. 4,800 calories. A figure so distant from their reality it seemed almost fictional, yet documented in black ink on paper. How had the Americans achieved such logistical perfection? Tanaka wondered. How could supply lines traverse thousands of miles of hostile ocean and jungle territory, arrive intact, and still reach frontline units in pristine condition? The questions multiplied. And more troubling still, how could the men consuming these calories endure the relentless punishment of combat, march all day, fight all night, and sustain such energy over months of conflict? It was not merely food. It was a a shock that undermined every assumption they had held about human limits. As Tanaka read aloud to the officers, describing the contents of the rations in meticulous detail, a sense of despair mingled with awe spread through the group. Bread, canned meats, chocolate, powdered milk, instant coffee, he whispered, voice catching. 4,800 calories a day, while we manage barely 1,200. Murmurs rippled through the men, low and hushed. The numbers were incomprehensible. Corporal Hiroshi Matsuda, aged 26, pressed his hand to his chest, feeling the hollowness there, the gnawing hunger that had accompanied him since dawn. Every previous struggle, the climb over fallen logs, the slog through mud, the effort to maintain alertness, now seemed futile by comparison. The Americans were not merely fed, they were empowered, fortified in ways that turned their very sustenance into a weapon. Here, in this jungle, the enemy could march with confidence, strike with precision, and recover with astonishing speed, all while the Japanese forces laboured under an invisible deficit that gnawed at their bodies and minds alike. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, O'Connor and his comrades were unaware of the revelation unfolding within enemy lines. They laughed over cups of hot cocoa, shared Type C ration biscuits, or tore into cans of meat, the heat of the afternoon mitigated by exhaustion tempered by the energy their food had supplied. A Marine aged 22, Private Samuel Hayes, cracked a joke about chocolate rations melting before breakfast and watched his friends chuckle. Lieutenant Benton, aged 32, observed with quiet satisfaction as his men cleaned weapons, maintained gear, and prepared for the next patrol. Their energy, alertness, and morale were sustained not by luck or chance, but by meticulous planning and the invisible advantage of calories. Every ounce of food consumed translated into operational effectiveness. Muscles recovered faster, minds stayed sharp, reflexes were quick, and endurance seemed limitless. To the Americans, these meals were comfort and sustenance, almost a normalcy amid chaos, yet the very abundance became a strategic advantage that shaped the battlefield as surely as any rifle, artillery, or amphibious landing. Back in the jungle, Tanaka's men processed the implications slowly. Hunger was no longer simply a physical trial. It was a strategic disadvantage, a silent enemy that eroded their capacity before bullets or bayonets could even engage. Each officer considered the tactical ramifications. Could they plan offensives against men so well fed and energized? Could they anticipate movement, counterstrikes, or resist attacks when their own bodies protested each exertion? The discovery was more than a numerical revelation. It was psychological, moral, and existential. It reframed the conflict in terms that were immediate and inescapable. The Americans' advantage was not only in weapons or numbers, but in the very fuel that powered their soldiers' bodies, minds, and spirits. Tanaka tried to explain the numbers to his men, emphasizing understanding over despair. They consume 4,800 calories a day, he said, voice low, eyes scanning the weary faces before him. We have 1,200. We must recognize this. It is a truth of this war. It does not mean we are defeated, but we must fight differently, adapt, and endure. Yet the weight of the revelation pressed down on every soldier. Private Saito, aged 19, shivered despite the heat, imagining a body fueled by nearly 4 times the energy he had received. Even seasoned veterans, accustomed to hardship, felt the sting of inadequacy. They had endured months of marches, skirmishes, and relentless patrols, yet never had they encountered such a stark illustration of the enemy's preparation. The manual was more than paper. It was proof of a systemic, almost industrial-scale efficiency, one that could sustain human performance under conditions that made the Japanese soldiers' own limitations painfully visible. The sun began its slow descent, casting the jungle in long, dappled shadows. Tanaka's patrol set up temporary shelters, arranging makeshift hammocks and lean-tos, conserving what energy remained. They shared scraps of dried fish and barley, trying to make each small morsel last, the act of eating overshadowed by the knowledge of what they had learned. The Americans, by contrast, would dine that evening with hot cocoa, rations replenished, spirits buoyed, ready to engage the next day with minimal fatigue. The disparity was both palpable and invisible, a gulf of calories, energy, and logistical excellence separating the two forces. It was a battle fought silently, in the marrow and sinew of men's bodies, beyond the scope of strategy or weaponry, yet as decisive in shaping outcomes as any firefight, ambush, or artillery bombardment. Tanaka lay awake that night on a thin mat of leaves, staring at the stive, jungle canopy where small holes of moonlight pierced the foliage. He considered the implications for the upcoming engagements, for the morale of his men, for the endurance required to survive each patrol. 4,800 calories. The number echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the invisible edge possessed by the enemy. He thought of O'Connor and the Americans, their laughter over cocoa and chocolate, their strength, their alertness, their ability to endure. How could one hope to match that with such limited sustenance? The manual had revealed a truth that no amount of bravery or discipline could completely negate. Nourishment was power, and scarcity was a handicap as cruel and unyielding as any battlefield. In the following days, the captured manual became both a source of anxiety and a guide. Officers debated strategies, adjustments to patrol schedules, and methods to conserve energy. They discussed rationing, pacing, and careful management of physical exertion. Yet the shadow of 4,800 calories loomed over every decision. Each mile, each swing of a machete, each cautious step through mud and vine was informed by the inescapable comparison to the enemy, men fortified by a nearly unimaginable abundance. The realization reshaped the way they thought, the way they moved, the way they endured. Hunger was no longer just a personal trial, it was a tactical consideration, a factor influencing the potential outcomes of every engagement. Across the Pacific, the Americans remained blissfully unaware of the awe and disbelief they had inspired. O'Connor polished his boots with a scrap of canvas, shared chocolate with a friend, and laughed at a joke about a fellow Marine who had accidentally dropped his ration tin into a puddle. The Type C and Type A meals continued to sustain them, calories converted seamlessly into endurance, alertness, and combat readiness. The invisible advantage of nutrition remained firmly in place, a silent, yet decisive factor shaping the flow of the war in the Pacific. It was a reminder that while bullets, bombs, and strategy were visible, tangible elements of combat, the human body's capacity to endure, recover, and fight was as much a weapon as any rifle, and food meticulously prepared, abundant, and strategically distributed was the engine driving it. By the end of the fourth day after the discovery, Tanaka and his officers had internalized the lessons. They approached every patrol with careful consideration of energy expenditure, attempted to ration their limited calories with extreme precision, and instilled in their men an understanding of the invisible edge held by their enemy. Yet, the psychological impact lingered, a quiet, gnawing knowledge of disparity that could not be undone. 4,800 calories. It was a number that haunted dreams, informed tactics, and underscored every decision. Hunger, once simply a physical trial, had become a strategic factor, shaping every action, every engagement, and every measure of endurance in the unforgiving jungle. As the Pacific sun set behind the ridges and valleys of Guadalcanal, casting shadows that stretched like fingers across the forest floor, Tanaka reflected on the invisible weapon the Americans wielded. Food, meticulously planned and abundant, was not merely nourishment. It was power, morale, and endurance distilled into a tangible form, a quiet yet decisive factor that dictated the limits of human capability in the jungle. And while his men slept, rations meagre and hunger gnawing, he understood that the battle for survival was not just fought with rifles and bayonets, but with calories, logistics, and the capacity of the human body to endure the rigors of war. The field manual lay open beside him, a stark testament to disparity, strategy, and the often unseen forces that shape history. 4,800 calories numbers on a page, yet a force as formidable as any cannon, as decisive as any ambush, and as transformative as any victory. Months passed in a haze of heat, salt and smoke as the Pacific campaigns raged on. The Marines advanced over islands with relentless determination, moving like tides that reshaped the terrain itself, their energy sustained by carefully measured rations. Each day, 4,800 calories coursed through their bodies, transforming canned meats, biscuits, chocolate, powdered milk, and instant coffee into strength, endurance, and unwavering resolve. The dense jungle, volcanic ash, and coral beaches tested every ounce of human fortitude, yet the Americans pressed forward, digging foxholes, clearing enemy positions, and marching through mud and sweat without pause. In contrast, Japanese units staggered under the weight of hunger. 1,200 calories a day, thin rice, scraps of dried fish, occasional whale or rabbit meat could not fuel the same intensity. Soldiers collapsed mid-march, hands trembling, stomachs gnawed by emptiness. Yet they pressed on, driven by discipline, loyalty, and the fear of dishonor. Letters from home, when they arrived, offered scant comfort. Letters from command rarely lifted the gnawing despair of starvation. Over time, the contrast became as stark as the battles themselves. The Americans' abundant nutrition was a force multiplier, allowing them to fight harder, recover faster, and endure longer. The Japanese, despite extraordinary resilience, were worn down by attrition, disease, and exhaustion. History would record the victories the islands secured, the strategic advances, the lives spared, but behind each triumph lay the invisible calculus of survival. 4,800 calories versus 1,200. A number, yes, but also a weapon, a shield, and in many cases, the line between life and death, shaping the Pacific War in ways history often overlooks. Decades later, the jungles of Guadalcanal had softened under time, trees arching over abandoned, foxholes, vines draping rusted artillery like forgotten banners. John O'Connor, now 83, walked slowly through the overgrown paths, a weathered photo album clutched in his hands. Each page brought memories of young men he had marched alongside, faces etched with sweat, mud, and determination, powered not just by courage, but by the steady rhythm of 4,800 calories a day. He remembered the chocolate, biscuits, powdered milk, canned meats, and the simple warmth of coffee that had fueled him through endless patrols, firefights, and storm-lashed nights. Across the Pacific, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka and his men had endured an entirely different struggle. 1,200 calories a day, thin rice, scraps of dried fish, the occasional rabbit or whale meat, a diet that tested the limits of the human body and spirit. O'Connor thought of Tanaka, imagining the Japanese officer's weary eyes and the quiet resilience of his men, fighting battles both with the enemy and with gnawing hunger. History recorded battles, medals, and strategies, but never the hidden war of calories, logistics, and endurance that shaped outcomes as decisively as any artillery strike. O'Connor smiled faintly, understanding that victory and survival were entwined with nourishment, preparation, and relentless willpower. 4,800 calories had made legends, 1,200 had forged ghosts. Both were heroes, bound by valor yet divided by circumstance. The jungle was silent, yet in that stillness the whispers of hunger and strength lingered, telling the story of a war fought not only with weapons, but with every bite, every heartbeat, and every ounce of enduring courage. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.